This is Invested in Climate with Jason Rissman. I see climate as the world's biggest, most diverse, most important movement in human history. Millions of people dedicate themselves every day to protecting the planet. This podcast shares conversations with advocates, entrepreneurs, investors, policy experts, and anyone else that can push our thinking about what's possible and what needs to happen to address climate change. If you have ideas for episodes or feedback, get in touch on LinkedIn. If you enjoy the show, please leave a rating on Apple or Spotify. I'm currently building a new venture. It's related to storytelling and how we engage all sorts of folks in meaningful climate action. If you have expertise in this area, big ideas, or examples of something that's really working, get in touch. Thanks for listening and for doing whatever it is you're doing to support climate progress. Okay, let's get started.
I think what we've seen is in order to be successful and really achieve that growth stage, climate companies do need to take advantage of the full capital stack. And it's not just a key competitive advantage commercially, but it's honestly a necessity. As I mentioned, we're not seeing that many companies get to scale without effective use of grant funding and other forms of non-dilutive funding at some point in their life cycle. There is a statistic that I like to cite, which is based on peer-reviewed study, that startups that secure grant funding are twice as likely to succeed as ones that do not.
Hi, folks. In just its first few weeks in power, the Trump administration has wreaked havoc to the climate tech landscape. An executive order aimed at accelerating fossil fuel extraction and slamming the brakes on renewables, and the freeze on all federal grants has already had a devastating effect. Even though the freeze was quickly rescinded, climate companies and organizations across the country are struggling to operate amidst uncertainty of whether the government will actually rescind their contractual obligations and cut funding. At stake are hundreds of billions of dollars that have been crucial to developing America's green economy. Clearly a good time to learn more about the importance of grant funding on climate tech. I sat down with Joel Armand-Holland, CEO of Climate Finance Solutions. Joel's company has helped climate businesses identify, apply for, and manage over $1.6 billion in non-dilutive grants. In this conversation, we spoke about how Joel's background led to a unique understanding of the importance of grants for climate companies, his company's track record and impact, how the funding landscape has changed, and much more. Even with federal funding potentially disappearing, there's still money on the table from other sources and a ton of complexity to navigate. So this episode will be the first in a series with Joel as we try to help you all find your way in this new era. Here we go. Hello, Joel. Welcome to Invested in Climate.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
So great to have you here. Thank you for joining. I believe you're dialing in from one of my favorite places in the world. Are you sitting amidst the redwoods in Humboldt County?
Indeed, I am. Yes, where all the big trees are here on the coast.
Fantastic. Well, lucky you. Hope to get back there very soon. Let's get started, Joel, and learn a bit about you and your background and how it led to founding Climate Finance Solutions.
Yeah, so I have worked in climate my whole career, and I've been working with climate grants in various capacities since 2004. Although I think that it's pretty common, anyone who works in grants full-time professionally, I think will tell you that they didn't set out to do that, to be a grants person. It's something that you pick up along the way, and it turns out you're good at it, and people keep asking you to do it more and more, and then it becomes your profession. So I've worked since 2004 on the granting side. So I was on the board of directors of a granting organization, and I worked on various climate jobs, including at a state regulatory agency that also happened to put grants out, worked in academic research, which obviously is related to grants, worked in a bioenergy company, had a variety of roles there, engineering and design, ran their manufacturing for a couple of years, moved over to project development, where we were developing projects both in the United States and 40 different countries around the world. Throughout my time at that company, we started applying for grants, and I was leading that process, and we were winning more and more grants. And so my job kind of transitioned into a lot of grant development in addition to project development. And then I got recruited to work for a company that was doing climate-related sustainable development work in Africa, moved abroad for a couple of years, mostly living in Europe. That was where the money people were. And when I moved back to the US, really at the very tail end of 2019, I'd left the company in Africa and was trying to figure out my next thing and realized that I could have a much bigger impact if I was working with and helping a large number of climate realized I could have a much larger impact if I was helping a lot of different companies at once instead of just helping them one at a time. So that was really the impetus to found CFS. And also having been in the space for a long time, I'd seen the fluctuations of grant funding. And there was this giant wave of grant funding hitting the space and hitting an inflection point around that time, 2020, 2021. And there were a lot of really high impact climate startups and climate companies that just weren't pursuing grants, which is understandable. Most people don't know a lot about grants. It can be very difficult and time consuming and complex to pursue them. And I wanted to make sure that these really high impact companies were able to access this really important funding source. So we have built the company since there. We just passed 5 years, which is crazy.
Joel, I mean, really fascinating to hear about all the different companies that you worked for where grants were part of the story. Let's set the table a bit more with some context on why grants are so important. To address climate change, we know we need to invest trillions of dollars in industries of various levels of maturity. Tell us about the role of grants and why they're so important.
Grants are very important for a variety of technologies, but especially in climate. I think grants are a non-dilutive form of funding, so they do not need to be repaid. They're not exactly free money, which is a phrase that we hear a lot. It's a common misconception, right? Grants do often require you to achieve specific milestones to receive the full amount of funding, especially for the larger scale grants that we often work with, and can be very complex to secure and also administer on the back end. But grants are also really a uniquely patient and risk tolerant form of capital, which is exactly the kind of funding that climate tech companies in particular need, given that they're often working with really cutting edge technologies that have long product and project development cycles. And so that's really why it's so important that climate tech founders in particular focus on grants as a key form of funding, key form of capital stack that really fits into, at this point, every company stage. I think historically, climate grant funding was mostly at the R&D stage, but I think both due to the overall maturation of climate technologies and also in the past few years, more funding coming into the system, grants are really now available throughout the company lifecycle. And this is a really important development because grants are basically specifically aimed at and perfect for overcoming for what they call valleys of death for climate tech companies, where basically other forms of capital may not be available because of the risk at each one of those points. And grants can really bridge not only the startup and product development valleys of death, but also now are available to bridge those for demonstration and deployment as well. And if you're able to effectively integrate grants with other parts of the capital stack, it can really help companies accelerate seamlessly through both their development stages and into growth and scaling stages. I'd say that most highly successful growth and later stage climate tech companies have leveraged grants at some point, in my experience.
Joel, give us a sense of where this capital comes from. How fragmented and complex is the ecosystem for this kind of funding?
Yeah, so the ecosystem for grant funding and other forms of climate-related non-dilutive funding is very broad ranging. It's quite complex. There is, unfortunately, very little centralization of funding or operation or even information about the ecosystem. I think in the US, most people are probably aware of some federal government grant programs. SBIR is Small Business Innovation Research is very well known. In the federal government, there are over a dozen granting agencies, major granting agencies. All of them have a number of offices or directorates or whatever they call their different divisions, all of which have some commonalities within the agency, but they all have their own areas of focus, priorities, objectives, language that they use. And so you have to understand how to design and frame your project specifically for each one. It does get nuanced very quickly. It's changing a bit now with the new administration, but the federal government's been putting out over $100 billion a year for climate for the last few years. So there's a lot of funding coming out from all these places. It's not all coming from the federal government. Obviously, there are a lot of states, all with their various agencies, local and regional governments, quasi-government agencies like air districts. And of course, it's not just in the US. Europe has these very giant pools of climate funding. We're working on a number of projects for the EU Innovation Fund right now, which is a $38 billion pool of funding. And the current call is 3.4 billion euros. In Europe, the funding is largely at the EU level because they aggregate funding from all the different countries. But there's also grants available at the national and subnational level as well in the EU. And then, of course, the developing world, which there definitely is a huge gap in climate funding there. But there is an ecosystem with multilateral agencies like the World Bank, Asian Development Bank, Green Climate Fund, the whole alphabet soup of multilaterals, the bilateral aid agencies, development finance institutions, and then funding as well to some degree from philanthropic sources and corporates and others.
Yeah, you didn't mention private foundations, but also seemingly a source of capital and not afraid to support industry increasingly. So I guess this is where Climate Finance Solutions enters, as you've described a market with lots of different sources of capital and a lot of complexity. How does your company help climate businesses navigate the space?
Climate Finance Solutions primarily supports companies in securing grant funding. We also do work with tax credits and government secured debt, but mostly grants. We are focused only on climate, but we say that we're sector agnostic. So we work with pretty much every sector and industry vertical. I mean, climate does touch everything. We provide services throughout the grant's life cycle. So all the way from grant identification and assessment. We have a process we call mapping the funding ecosystem to do that. We have a grant monitoring service that provides real-time monitoring of the grants that are available for an individual company. We provide consulting services around funding strategy, funder engagement. Because we mostly work with government sources, this is mostly engaging with funding agencies. We also obviously do proposal development and not just writing up a concept that someone has in a format that an agency is looking for, but really participating in many cases very deeply in project design, project scoping, strategic partnership development, assembling consortia, in addition to technical and commercial consulting in that area, and also obviously developing the proposal itself. And then we provide post-award management services as well, so helping folks through the contracting process and providing full scope reporting to help them manage the grants. I've been very intentional about building a team with a lot of technical depth. I think that's really one of our key differentiators. More than half of the folks on our technical team have PhDs, but not just academics with PhDs, it's folks that have experience with the private sector in the commercial space. We work mostly with companies, and so it's really important to understand product development and motivations and other elements that are particular to the private sector. And a lot of us have worked in climate tech companies, so we've gone through R&D and the product development cycle and commercialization and growth and scaling. So we've been on the side of the table of our clients, the difference being that we also know how to secure grant funding at a large scale for most stages or every stage of the company process. So I like to say we kind of have a whole company full of unicorns with these very rare combinations of skill sets that are really essential to helping climate businesses fully navigate the space and be successful.
Okay, so 5 years in, a team of unicorns. Tell us what you've been able to achieve. What sort of traction and impact have you been able to accomplish?
Impact is definitely the right word. We are a fully mission-driven company, top to bottom. We're pretty selective about the clients that we work with, and we select them based on climate impact. In addition to being sector agnostic, we're stage agnostic. So it's not just about working with large companies that have immediate climate impact, but it's also about potential climate impact. What is the ability of this technology or solution at scale to achieve climate impact, whether that's on the mitigation or adaptation side? We also have an equity and justice lens that we use to select our clients. That's looking both at the composition of the team and the founders, but also how much are they thinking about integrating equity and justice into both how they're deploying and how they're developing their products. Also thinking about our impact both at a global scale. And I'd like to think that part of our impact at least is not just how we select our clients and who we help, but it's actually how we're helping design the projects and helping folks select the projects that they work on and helping insert actual activities that promote both climate impact and equity and justice into the projects that we're working on. To date, since I founded the company in 2020, we've secured over $1.6 billion in grant funding for our clients. We have expanded our services again throughout the grant's life cycle. We work globally. So I'm based here in California, but our team is very far flung. We have folks all over North America and in Africa and Europe. Since we've been in business for so long, we've really you have clients that we work with for many years, and we've been able to take projects all the way from identifying the grant, writing the grant, conceiving of it and then actually supporting execution as well, which is very rewarding to see, a project that you designed in your home office actually come to life, and have been fortunate to actually get on site and visit some of those projects.
Can you share some examples? I'd love to hear about some of the companies that have been successful.
Yeah. So in thinking about different case studies, not only for this interview, but just in general, when I'm doing talks, it's very difficult to select because we've done such a wide range of projects and worked with so many.
Always hard to pick your favorites, but we know they're not your favorites. They're just representative examples.
Yeah, exactly. I think we've done quite a bit of work and won a lot of funding for industrial decarbonization. There's a lot of different types of technologies there. One of the companies that we work with is called Rondo. They have a thermal heat battery that's really innovative. We wrote and won a $70 million grant from the Office of Clean Energy Demonstration, which has a one-to-one match. So that was nearly $150 million project in total. And they were able to fully decarbonize some bottling plants and distilleries for one of the largest multinational corporations working in the food and beverage space. We do as much as we can with tribal communities here in the US and indigenous communities around the world. One of the coolest companies that we worked with was helping tribal communities on the island of Mindanao in the Philippines, which has had an armed insurgency, helping tribal communities get their land rights back and then cultivate the native giant bamboo for exporting carbon negative building materials to international markets and helping bring sorely needed funds to those communities. There's also USDA, and that funding was from USAID. There was also a USDA project for climate smart commodities. We actually saw this funding opportunity, thought that they would be a really great opportunity for some of our clients, went to our clients, pitched them on it, really helped form the consortium, including helping get the Nature Conservancy to lead the application, won $60 million for agroforestry and regenerative agriculture project, which was really great. We've been able to visit some of those projects. We, again, like working with tribal communities here in the US, we won a grant that was over $400 million to help provide financing for tribal communities working in Europe with clients doing large-scale carbon capture and so many others. But I guess those are some representative examples.
Joel, talk to us about the impact of grants, especially those large ones, on the companies. Might the influx of capital in some ways distort their organization in a way and create problems down the line? Or are they set up always to be more successful?
Yeah, I think what we've seen is in order to be successful and really achieve that growth stage, climate companies do need to take advantage of the full capital stack. And it's not just a key competitive advantage commercially, but honestly a necessity. That, as I mentioned, we're not seeing that many companies get to scale without effective use of grant funding and other forms of non-dilutive funding at some point in their life cycle. There is a statistic that I like to cite, which is based on peer-reviewed study, that startups that secure grant funding are twice as likely to succeed as ones that do not. That said, in order to be successful with this form of funding and ensure that it will have the positive impact you want, because it doesn't automatically have that impact, you really have to be strategic about how you are thinking about and pursuing this funding. So you're not just pursuing grants because they're there or you think that they're free money, but because you are going after the right grants to pursue and they're part of a more integrated fundraising strategy. And this is something that we help our clients with a lot in our funding strategy sessions. And the ability to effectively integrate those different elements of the capital stack is really key to being successful with grants and just generally with various forms of funding. There are benefits and drawbacks to every single type of funding in each part of the capital stack. And part of the benefit of having an integrated fundraising strategy is really understanding how each element works and enabling each one to mitigate the drawbacks of the others. For example, grant funding can be very complex. It can be very time consuming. There is a lot of, in many cases, especially with government funding, substantial post-award management that's required in reporting. There are lag times before receiving funding. So for climate startups and just companies in general, you have to have this integrated fundraising strategy. There's really no one size fits all. The strategy really needs to be tailored to the needs and specifics of your company. So looking at your technology roadmap and your pathway to commercialization and scale using in the non-dilutive funding that you've identified in your identification and assessment process, in our ecosystem mapping process, matching that available grant funding or non-dilutive funding up to the relevant points in your roadmap, the relevant projects that it could fund, and then identifying where you can use equity investment or other forms of funding to fill those gaps. Or conversely, if more or less you're raising an equity round at a certain time of a certain amount, you can do it the opposite way and figure out where the other gaps are and how you're able to fill those gaps with grants or other forms of non-dilutive funding.
I really like the framing around an integrated fundraising strategy. I think even that terminology adds some nuance. A lot of folks will just think about fundraising strategy, but clearly with a diversified capital stack, it takes thinking and being strategic to figure out the right type of capital in the right moment. Joel, grant capital can be so attractive that it can easily lure companies off track to chase money that's not really aligned to their strategy. I'm sure you've seen that happen. How do you help companies stay on track and make sure that grant capital is only influencing them in positive ways?
Yeah, I definitely have seen companies chasing grant funding and other forms of funding off of their roadmap. If you're not applying for the right grants, it can be very distracting to a company. And if you're executing on a grant project that's not well aligned, it can be a waste of your time and other forms of resources. And obviously, time always being the most precious resource in any company, but especially a startup. It can also be pretty heartbreaking, at least difficult, maybe that's a better word, to win a grant and then only then realize that it's not well aligned, that you can't take it and then have to abandon it, not get contracted for it. This is part of an issue with how most folks go after grants, which is really identification and assessment in an opportunistic manner. They just see random opportunities, or folks tell them about something, or they do maybe minimal research. And that's why having a comprehensive and strategic process for grant identification and assessment is so important. So our ecosystem mapping process, which we certainly don't have a monopoly on, we've just made the identification and assessment process more standardized and rigorous, where we go through this really comprehensive search of an ecosystem that we've defined based on the elements of a company's strategy, looking at literally thousands of funding opportunities and hundreds of funders, and down selecting that based on the company's specific priorities to create a funding pipeline that allows us to identify the opportunities, both that they'll have the highest chance of success with and are also the most well aligned with what the company needs to do. And in their roadmap, anyone can follow that basic template. Again, you also have to basically start with, before you can even do that process, you need to be clear on and define your company priorities and have a technology roadmap that goes out several years into the future to even do that mapping process effectively. If you're going to have grant funding as a key part of the funding strategy and make sure that you're not chasing it off track, the availability and alignment of grant funding should certainly be taken into account as one data point in your company strategy, and could be an important data point depending on how big of an element it is of your integrated fundraising strategy. That's really all it is. It's one data point. It definitely should not be dictating the company's strategy.
Joel, let's turn to the elephant in the room. Federal investment has been incredibly important for climate companies. You've talked about federal grants. Those were recently frozen, at least temporarily, and are still under threat. You mentioned USAID, also under threat. How is the Trump administration changing this landscape, and how much opportunity still remains?
Yeah, so we're talking about 3 weeks into the new administration, and it's definitely been a few weird weeks and honestly months since the election, and there is plenty more where that came from. I think the election outcome the word is catastrophic for climate in a lot of different ways. Other areas, like the heartbreaking results of USAID being hollowed out and foreign aid being cut off. I mean, having worked in the developing world for many years, that those impacts really hit home for me personally. In terms of the actions that the administration has taken in the first few weeks, my analysis is really hasn't changed based on those actions from where it was pre them taking power or even pre-election. I think in general, we know that the election outcome means that there will be reductions, probably dramatic reductions in federal spending on climate, but there's a very high degree of uncertainty in the specifics of how that is going to roll out and how that's going to affect individual programs. I think that we can be reasonably confident that what they initially wanted to do, which is an outright full repeal of the Inflation Reduction Act and bipartisan infrastructure law, and other big climate legislation that's come out during the Biden administration, is unlikely based on the statements from Republican senators. So there's just not the votes in the Senate most likely to fully repeal them. Part of that is because over 80% of the funds from those bills have gone to red states. So they actually are seeing the benefits. Even if they're not focused on the climate benefits, they can at least see the financial and jobs and economic benefits. But even without a full repeal, Congress will likely at some point in the administration make changes. But the executive branch does have the power immediately to make pretty dramatic unilateral changes to grant programs, the many tax credits that were put forth by the IRA, and even the structure of administrative agencies, like doing away with various offices. You mentioned the funding freeze that happened last week. The week before that was the quote unquote Unleashing American Energy executive order, which came out on day one. That paused climate related IRA and BIL spending. That was expected. And I think that really just put the predicate in place to let them do what they want to do to those programs down the line. I think really what remains to be seen is what happens to the details of those technologies and programs. And we'll really only know that in the coming months and years. With regard to the funding freeze, I think that it was pretty clear that they knew that that wouldn't stand up in court, and it didn't. And it also, they rescinded it within a couple of days. And I think, in my view, it was really more intended to have a chilling effect for people to be worried and freaked out and stop applying and stop doing projects, and was like more like a shot across the bow, including to folks that have grant contracts. And in my view, that was pretty successful. They did succeed in chilling a lot of grants activity in climate where the executive order did less to make people concerned. They did pause payments to people with grants contracts, although we're now seeing a lot of those invoices starting to be paid. But we know that they're actively reviewing thousands of grant programs. New York Times had a list of 2,600 programs that they were looking at, and a lot of those will be either canceled or significantly changed in entire offices at DOE and other agencies like the Office of Clean Energy Demonstration, from which we have won literally hundreds of millions of dollars in the last few years, are at risk of being fully shut down. I think there will be overall reductions in funding for sure, but the impact on different industries or technologies and programs is going to be very uneven. I think in some cases, there'll be minimal reductions for some areas and maybe even funding increases. So the administration, with some areas of bipartisan agreement and statements from the administration prior to taking power and since taking power, they are interested in funding nuclear, geothermal. Chris Wright, the incoming Secretary of Energy, is a fracking and geothermal guy. They're interested in grid modernization, advanced manufacturing, some biofuels. There's a lot of oil majors that are highly invested in carbon capture, so it seems likely that they'll successfully lobby for some of that funding, maybe even direct air capture, which oil majors are also invested in, could sneak in under that, under there. There's a lot of bipartisan support for agriculture and, especially in ag, sectors and agencies that are not funded by the boogeyman of the IRA and BIL will be safer from interference. But there are a lot of technologies and sectors that are very explicitly, they've said they're targeting, right? EVs, electric vehicles, electric vehicle infrastructure, battery technologies, offshore wind, a lot of sectors in the middle there that will see some reductions here and there. I think that folks have also been concerned about what's going to happen for grants that are awarded. Are they going to, if you have a grant contract, which previously were pretty ironclad with the government, and agencies by law are not allowed to pause disbursement for signed award agreements. But I think with the funding freeze and just in general, this administration has proven their willingness to, polite way of saying it, is test the limits of the law and impound funds that Congress appropriated and work it out in the courts later. So even if they're not impounding funds, which I don't think they will do for the majority of contracted grants, There are things like a lot of grants, especially the Department of Energy, have budget periods where agencies technically have the ability to say, you haven't achieved your milestones, you're not enabled to go to the next budget period. I think they're going to process things like that to try to end projects early that they don't like. In terms of applying for grants, I think that you're going to have to change up what you're doing. You have to have even more clear-cut budget period milestones, maybe more achievable milestones. You have to change the framing in language, definitely reframing the grant applications away from equity and justice and toward the economy, even framing away from climate, if you can, as a primary objective of the project and toward other benefits. The National Science Foundation had an entire list of words that are basically no-go words that you can't include in grant applications. But it's not just language, right? We're talking about you need to change the scope, even the partners that you're working with, the applications of your technology, where you're doing demos and pilots. So there is just a kind of profound difference in how folks are needing to approach grants. And I think that it's not to say that you should not apply for federal grants at all right now, or that there will be no federal grants going forward, but you do need to make a very informed, clear-eyed decision based on sector, funding source, program topic area. If you can get inside information, try to do that and just make an analysis of the risk level that you're willing to tolerate. And I guess to the second part of your question, it is important to note that there will be, again, some federal funding left, but there are a lot of other sources of grants. There are states and a lot of other funders. This happened in the first Trump administration, and some states like California, have already said they're going to actually increase their commitments to climate to make up for federal reductions. Some philanthropists have already announced this. So there will still be grant funding. We're just going to have to learn how to navigate the ecosystem in a different way and navigate the process in a different way.
Joel, give us a sense of the scale of federal grant dollars and how it's compared to other sources of capital. State, philanthropy, governments abroad, how do they compare?
Yeah, just to give a sense of scale, prior to the IRA and bipartisan infrastructure law and these big bills that happened during the Biden administration, which took climate spending up to over $100 billion a year, generally climate spending through appropriations was about $28-30 billion a year through the normal appropriations process. And that was more or less steadily, slowly increasing, and even increased during the last Trump administration, which will not again happen in this administration. So that's kind of availability from the federal government on an annual basis. On a state level, California, by far the biggest player. In 2022, California passed a bill that allocated $50 billion for over 6 years. So about $10 billion a year. And again, more spending is likely to come based on their statements. New York is, relatively speaking, the other biggest player on the state level. They have $10 billion allocated over 6 years and probably allocating a bit more. Other states like Massachusetts just released $1 billion climate tech spending plan. Washington State has a lot of grants for climate, and other states as well. And then states that you wouldn't think of as climate friendly, like Texas has grants that we have applied to and successfully for advanced manufacturing incentives. And so climate tech companies can actually take advantage of programs that are not necessarily climate specific, but if you think a little bit creatively, you can secure funding from those programs as well. Also thinking about the European market, again, there are some very large funding pools for climate in Europe. The Innovation Fund program that I mentioned previously, $38 billion over 10 years. The Horizon Europe program, a third of that 95 billion euro fund is dedicated to climate. So that's another 30-ish billion euros. The EU Life program is about 5 billion. A lot of funding available there. And some of this funding, including the Innovation Fund, is accessible to American companies and companies from elsewhere. The Horizon Europe program is accessible for a wide range of countries as well. On the philanthropic side, to give you a sense of scale, so globally from foundations, about $1.9 billion a year comes out for climate, and that's still only 2% of global philanthropy. And the majority of that is not allocated to the private sector, although, as you pointed out, that is starting to change a bit. But in terms of scale, California alone is 5 times more than that per year. So it's much less, but philanthropy definitely has a really important role to play, especially in certain areas where they can catalyze blended finance or provide smaller grants that can help catalyze different elements of a business.
Joel, thank you. A great run through of the overall landscape, how it's changing, and how it creates all the more complexity for companies. And not necessarily the picture that we want to see in terms of availability of funds, but by no means is the opportunity totally gone. So still the important role of non-dilutive capital and grants, something that companies really should be thinking about and something that we want to talk more about. This episode is the first in a series. Making sure companies learn about grants funding is really important. As you mentioned, it really can be an important ingredient in the long-term success of companies. And so we're going to be doing a deep dive. And actually, you'll be doing the deep dive and hosting some upcoming episodes. What sorts of questions will you be exploring?
Yeah, so very much looking forward to that. We'll be exploring a lot of the themes that we talked about today. What does the funding landscape look like? Doing a deeper dive there, how to understand it and navigate it, especially as it's shifting. How to do that really important process that I talked about multiple times of strategically identifying, assessing, and strategizing for grants. How do you do effective and efficient post-award management? Some inside scoops on how funding agencies approach and think about grants. Funding agencies, I think, at multiple levels of government. We'll talk about grants from founders' perspective. How do folks that are inside the companies think about grants? How do they operationalize them with their team? What resources do they need to dedicate? And then integration of other forms of financing. How do you develop that integrated fundraising strategy and most effectively leverage grants to your benefit?
I'm sure you will be keeping us current as news from Washington continues to evolve.
Absolutely.
Joel, thank you for the work that you're doing. Thanks for your time today and looking forward to learning more.
Thanks for having me. It was super fun.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Invested in Climate. Please remember to rate us on Apple, Spotify, or Google. Find show notes, sign up for updates, get in touch, and visualize your climate action at investedinclimate.com. This podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only and does not constitute financial, accounting, or legal advice. Thanks again.